We are going to talk about a few things about the respiratory system, just so that you are aware of a few things that I just want you to understand a little better, because I think it's very confusing. You can listen to my PowerPoint. It goes over the PowerPoint with my voiceover, so that will work as well. But there's a few things that are a little bit confusing, so I thought I would just go over them. When we talk about movement of air in and out of the lungs, atmospheric pressure is very important in this whole aspect of things. And this is where understanding physics helps a little bit, just because our respiratory system is open to the outside world. And so because of that, when the atmospheric pressure drops or rises, that helps us to breathe. So when we breathe in, our diaphragm contracts, and when it does that, it actually makes this space bigger. So now there's not as much pressure in there, and so atmospheric pressure naturally, like air naturally comes in because of atmospheric pressure into our system. Then when we breathe out, the diaphragm relaxes, and now this space is really small, and that's built up a lot of pressure. So naturally, air wants to go out too. So atmospheric pressure helps us in breathing as well. So if we talk about atmospheric pressure is measured in millimeters of mercury. Hg is mercury. And it is measured at about 760 millimeters of mercury. And that's at sea level, so it's going to be a little bit less here for us. So when we really look at the composition of what the atmosphere is, a lot of people sometimes don't understand this, and I just fudge the numbers just to make it easier. But there's about 160 millimeters of mercury of oxygen, and there is about 600, we'll say, millimeters of mercury of nitrogen. There's a little bit of other stuff. There's about 1% or so of argon, neon, and some other things. But for our purposes, we're just going to ignore that to make the math easy. Okay, so when we talk about this part of atmospheric pressure, these are considered partial pressures. So this is the partial pressure of oxygen in the atmosphere, in the total. And this is the partial pressure of nitrogen in the total of atmospheric pressure. So we tend to talk about partial pressures a lot. And then if we try to remember some things about diffusion, it helps us also to understand how easy it is for oxygen to get into our system. So in the alveoli, and the alveoli are the air sacs at the very end of our lungs, and we'll get into that in lab next time. But the little air sacs, the alveoli, the partial pressure of oxygen is 103 millimeters. Okay, so if we think about, this is the atmosphere, and this is the pressure in the alveoli. So if we think about diffusion, it goes from an area of high concentration to low concentration. Naturally, oxygen diffuses then into the alveoli. And then if we look at the capillaries, and the capillaries are little blood vessels that are around the air sacs, their partial pressure of oxygen is about 40 millimeters. So it's this beautiful system where oxygen diffuses into the air sacs, and then it easily diffuses into our capillaries, and then is taken to the rest of our body. So we utilize that system of diffusion using no energy for our body to get oxygen. We're going to do the opposite for carbon dioxide. So we have to breathe out carbon dioxide, because if we don't, it acidifies our blood, and it's very dangerous. So in the capillaries, carbon dioxide is going to be much higher. I don't have those exact numbers because I don't really care about that as much, but let's say it's opposite. 140, and then it's 110, and then it's 100. So carbon dioxide easily diffuses out of the capillaries or the venules into the air sacs, and then from the air sacs into the atmosphere. So it's a really beautiful system using that partial pressure to our advantage. So that's the whole partial pressure thing that I want you to think about. Then there's a part that's a little more confusing. And so in the alveoli, we'll just take one little alveoli, or alveolus, one little air sac. The pressure inside that air sac is called intra-alveolar pressure, or IAP. And that pressure is very strong to make sure that those air sacs don't collapse. Then there's another pressure that takes place, and if we look at our lungs have this double lining. And in that double lining, it's called the pleural cavity. There's a lot of water, a lot of moisture. There's a lot of water on lungs. And when we think about water, I want you to remember about hydrogen bonding. Because in hydrogen bonding, remember that bond is really, really strong between those water molecules. So if you have a lot of water in here, there's a resistance for the lungs to stretch because of that hydrogen bonding. So there's a couple things that go on in here. So there's pressure because of the atmosphere in this direction. We call that intrapleural pressure, or IPP. And it's going against the alveoli, but the alveoli push back against that IPP, and that's what prevents our lungs from collapsing. Now, if you were to stick a knife in here and open up that intrapleural pressure, now there's so much pressure from the outside atmosphere that it'll collapse those alveoli. And that's how lungs collapse, is when something like that happens. Okay, so, which takes me to the stretchiness of lungs. So when we talk about lungs stretching, they need to be able to stretch out in order to get as much oxygen, as much air in there as possible. And so what that stretching is called is compliance. So compliance is the ability for the lungs to stretch effectively. So and it takes about 3% of daily energy to inspire or to breathe in. If lungs are damaged, let's say you have tuberculosis, or no, let's pick one that's easier than that. Let's pick, what's the smoking one? It might have a mental break right now. Anyway, if you smoke, emphysema. I need more coffee or something. Anyway, emphysema. So if you have emphysema, what happens is there's a lot of scarring that takes place in your lungs. And instead of having your alveoli have all of those small cells, and alveoli mean, in Latin, mean grape cluster, or cluster of grapes. And so it's all those little cells. And we talked about surface to volume ratio a long time ago. Okay, so the more small cells you have, increased surface area, increased amount of oxygen going in and carbon dioxide going out. In emphysema, what happens is those interior walls break down. So now what you're left with is this gigantic cell. Decrease in surface area, the inability to get enough oxygen in for your daily needs. And somebody with emphysema then spends between 30 and 50% of their energy to inspire. So they have to be on oxygen in order to do that, and it's very challenging for them. To walk down the hallway will wipe them out for the rest of the day. Okay, so the other aspect of this stretching that you need to think about is hydrogen bonds are very strong, and they prevent stretching. So when you think about two microscope slides that are wet, that are close together, it's nearly impossible to pry them apart. Sometimes you have to stick something in between there to pry those two microscope slides apart when they're wet, because the hydrogen bonds are super strong. So that's happening in the lungs too. And one of the things we need to do is to produce a fatty substance to break down that hydrogen bonding. And so the lungs produce something called surfactant. And surfactant is a lipoprotein. So the lipo part is that fat part, and it helps to lower the surface tension, which allows our lungs to stretch. So all of those things are super important in breathing. So when we talk about like premature babies, for instance, and this is a topic that comes up a lot, you know, premature babies now can survive at 23 weeks, maybe 22, but 22 is not going to be a healthy baby. Usually 23, 24 weeks, they can actually survive and do okay. Some babies have a lot of problems. They can have strokes because of the oxygen that you have to give them. And the reason you have to give them oxygen is because when people are pregnant, there's kind of a peaking and a drop, and a peaking and a drop of surfactant production by the fetus. Now, why is that? Well, if we think about it, they're not using their lungs. They're not breathing yet. They're getting all their oxygen from their mother in the placenta. So they don't actually need to be utilizing the whole lung thing. In fact, their lungs are all collapsed down when they're a fetus. So the surfactant is kind of, it's like practicing inside the body. And so we have these ebbs and flow of the surfactant. And so what's interesting is that it progresses to about 34 weeks. And then it decreases until 36 weeks, which doesn't make much sense, but it's just kind of a natural thing. It's like it gives it 2 weeks break. If a baby is born in this particular time, it can be challenging because they may not have enough surfactant. And babies that are 23, 24 weeks and earlier are not producing enough surfactant. So what they end up having to do, because that baby has very low fat reserves, and if we talk about daily inspiration and how much it takes to inspire, babies are going to be using this much because they're not producing enough surfactant. They're fighting against that hydrogen bonding. So they're going to need artificial surfactant in order to break down that surface tension. And so when we talk about that surfactant, now they use a biological technology to make surfactant from humans. And they used to use fetal cows to make the surfactant. But it's about approximately $10,000 per dose for a preemie. And sometimes they need 2 or 3 doses. So when we think about how expensive it is to have a preemie, in some cases, that's another added aspect. So when somebody has a baby that they can't stop and it's going to come out and it's at 23 or 24 weeks, that baby is in the ICU, the NICU, and being taken care of for quite some time. And so if they have to have a lot of these, you can see why it costs so much money for those premature babies. What's the other stuff I wanted to mention? That's the important parts for all of that. And then I also wanted to mention a couple other things. When we think about breathing regulation, it occurs in 2 places in the brain. So if we look at the brain stem, And we're not kind of there yet. So this is my little made-up brainstem. This is the pons, and this is the medulla oblongata, and then this would be spinal cord. So this is part of our brainstem. And we have a couple spots. There's 2 spots in the pons, and there's 2 spots in the medulla. And that's the ventral, dorsal, pneumatic, or pneumotaxic, sorry, pneumotaxic. Did I spell that right? Yeah, pneumotaxic and apneristic. So these are places that help us to breathe on a regular basis. And so when we look at the medulla, for instance, medulla oblongata, and what its job is. So this is more like our rhythmic breathing. This is what we call our pacemaker for breathing. It's going to set that regular pattern for us to breathe. And so the dorsal group, keep them all straight here, excites the inspiratory muscles. And it inhibits the inspiratory muscles. And so when it excites this is when we inspire, we breathe in when those muscles are excited, and when they're inhibited, we breathe out, we expire. And so that whole part of the dorsal group is just allowing our muscles, which are intercostal muscles, to help us to breathe in and out. The ventral part, ventral group, just don't want to get these mixed up. When we're doing active, vigorous breathing, this is when we're going to use more muscles. So we're going to excite it. Whoops. More muscles excited. So if we're working out, for instance, or we need more air, the ventral group is what's going to stimulate much faster breathing. Then we look at pons. The pons is going to, and we don't really need to understand totally what the pons does, but it mostly fine-tunes this. So the medulla is kind of the chunky breathe in, breathe out, breathe in. And the pons comes in and says, breathe in this much, breathe out that much. And it fine-tunes our breathing. And then we have this whole other aspect of things. So this is the autonomic part of our breathing. We also have a conscious breathing where we can make our diaphragm breathe in and out. Whenever I say that, then your body starts doing it, and now it messes up your natural breathing. And something to note is people that are put on ventilators because of COVID, one of the things they have to do is basically knock them out. They bring them to a very low conscious level when they're on a ventilator, because the problem is they need the ventilator to breathe for them, which the ventilator is kind of taking over that medulla and pons aspect of things. But if they're awake, that conscious wanting to breathe and fight against the ventilator happens. So that's why they have to bring them down to very low conscious so that they're not working against that ventilator. So it's really challenging. If you talk to people who've been on ventilators, they say it's really scary if they're awake because of that, because they feel like something's wrong with their breathing, because that machine is trying to take over and breathe for them. Okay, then the last thing I wanted to talk about was affinity for oxygen. The affinity means love or binding of oxygen by hemoglobin. So hemoglobin, if you remember, is a globular protein. It's in our blood, And every hemoglobin molecule holds 4 molecules of oxygen. And so that would be what we call fully saturated, if they have all of their 4 molecules of oxygen. So there are some things that can affect that affinity or binding of oxygen. And there are things that can interrupt that. And if we think about those things, they're the same things that interrupt, for instance, enzymes. So factors that affect affinity for hemoglobin to hold on to the oxygen. So that's that affinity. One is acidity. So if pH drops and you get more acidic, for instance, because of that, hemoglobin gives up oxygen. It starts releasing the oxygen if you have a high level of acid. So where do we get acid? If we have too much CO2 and we're not breathing enough out, it becomes carbonic acid. And carbonic acid then can build up in our blood, acidifying the blood. Hemoglobin gives up the oxygen. So that's bad. Lactic acid from muscle contraction. There's some new studies out that are showing that lactic acid actually gets taken up by your liver pretty quickly. However, if you have excess lactic acid, that can also cause that hemoglobin to, the hemoglobin to drop the oxygen. Another factor can be temperature. So as temperature increases, like let's say somebody has a fever, again, hemoglobin gives up its oxygen. So one of the things that will happen with like little kids, because they're not holding as much oxygen as we are, for instance, little kids will, when they have a fever, they'll pant because they're trying to breathe in as much oxygen as they can because their body's giving it up. And so that high temperature reduces that ability of the hemoglobin to hold on to oxygen. And then one of the other factors is something called BPG. BPG is biphosphogylycerate, which is why we never call it that. We call it BPG. It's easier to remember. And it also decreases the affinity for oxygen. And so one of the things is that it gets formed when red blood cells, and I'm going to call them RBCs, utilize glucose or hydrolyze the glucose for energy, for ATP. When they do that, one of the byproducts, unfortunately, is BPG. So one of the things that's kind of interesting is that at higher altitudes, red blood cells have to work harder. They have to constantly utilize glucose to make ATP because there's less oxygen available, so those red blood cells are working overtime. We produce at high altitude a lot more BPG than somebody who does at sea level, for instance. And if you have too much BPG, then you're decreasing your affinity for oxygen, and it's super challenging to breathe at high altitudes because of that. And then some hormones that increase this too are things like human growth hormone, which we talked about, epinephrine, so adrenaline can increase BPG because again you're quickly making ATP. Thyroxine, which is thyroid hormone, and testosterone. So all of those things can actually cause an increase in BPG too. Okay, I think those were the main things that I wanted to go over just because those things are kind of challenging for the respiratory system. Just make sure to look over the rest of the PowerPoint, and I go over a lot of those things, probably some similar things to in that PowerPoint.